I want to start with a thing I still can't make sit, right even after all these years. For about a year and a half, a man in our town spent his evenings welding steel plates onto a bulldozer. He poured concrete between the layers by hand in a shed at the edge of town. He cut gun ports. He mounted cameras so he could see out once he sealed himself inside. And the whole time he was building it month after month through 2 winters, he was the same man you'd wave to at the gas station. The same man who'd fix your muffler and not overcharge you. The same man who showed up to church. He was by most accounts one of the more decent people in Granby. And he was building something he meant to drive through the middle of all of us. That's the part I can't get past. Not the machine. The machine was a horror, but machines are just machines. What I can't get past is the year and a half. The slowness of it. The patience. A man can hate you in a hot flash, and you'll understand it. People lose their tempers. People do terrible things in a single bad second. But this wasn't a single bad second. This was 18 months of evenings. 18 months of a man going home, eating his supper, and walking out to the shed to keep working on the thing that would end his life, and very nearly end a lot of ours. And not one of us asked what was behind that wall. I've thought about why. I think it's because that's not how a small town works. You don't go knocking on a neighbor's shed door asking what he's up to. You assume the best. You assume a man tinkering is a man tinkering. We had no idea we were living next door to a countdown. So let me tell you about the town first. Because to understand what happened here, you have to understand what kind of place it was. And what kind of place it was is most of the story. Granby sits up in the mountains in a long valley in Grand County, Colorado. Back then we were maybe 1,600 people. You could drive the whole length of town in about 2 minutes if the one light cooperated. We had the things a town like that has: a hardware store, a department store that had been there longer than most of us, a bank, a library, a newspaper that came out once a week and told you who'd had a baby and who'd passed and what the town board was arguing about. There was always something the town board was arguing about. It's beautiful country. People come up here to ski, to fish, to look at the mountains and feel small in a good way. But living in a town like that year-round is a different thing than visiting it. In a town this size, everybody knows everybody, and that cuts both ways. It means somebody will plow your driveway when you're sick. It also means there's a way things get done, and there's a circle of people who decide how. And if you're inside that circle, life is smooth, and if you're outside, life is a series of small frictions you can never quite name. We had a name for it anyway: the good old boys. Every small town has them. The families that have been here longest, the businessmen who sit on the boards, the people whose handshake is worth more than your paperwork. It isn't a conspiracy. Nobody's twirling a mustache. It's just gravity. The town bends a little toward the people who've always run it. Marvin Heemeyer was not one of those people. He was an outsider, and he stayed one. He came from a dairy farm in South Dakota, served in the Air Force, then knocked around as a welder and a muffler man, good with his hands, good enough that people drove out of their way to bring him their cars. In the early 90s, he landed up here near a lake about 16 miles out, and he bought a couple of acres on the western edge of Granby for around $42,000 and put up a muffler shop, Mountain View Muffler. He was a single man, no wife, no kids. He had a few friends. He played the slots sometimes. He kept to himself mostly in the way a lot of men out here keep to themselves. And here's the thing you have to hold on to. Because it matters later, people liked him. He wasn't a crank that everybody crossed the street to avoid. He was polite. He was a hard worker. He did honest work at a fair price. If you'd asked me back then to make a list of the men in this town most likely to one day try to flatten it, his name would not have been on the list. It wouldn't have been on anybody's list. That's worth sitting with. Because the easy version of this story, the version the rest of the country eventually told about us, needs Marv to be either a hero or a monster, a pure victim or a pure madman. But the people who actually knew him will tell you he was neither, and that's exactly what makes it so hard to carry. He was a regular man. Whatever happened to him happened to a regular man. And if it can happen to a regular man, then it's not really about him at all. It's about the slow thing that was done to him, and about how a person decides one small grievance at a time that the rules no longer apply to him. So let me walk you through the small grievances, because that's how it built, not in one blow, in 100 little ones. It started with the land next door. There was a family in town that ran a concrete operation, and they wanted Marv's 2 acres. The land sat in a useful spot, and they came to him about buying it. From what I understand, they got close. There was a number somewhere around $250,000 and a handshake feeling the sense that a deal was nearly done. And then it wasn't. The price went up, then up again. Depending on who you ask, Marv pushed it from $250,000 to $375,000, then higher, and at one point somebody says he floated $1 million for that little patch of ground he'd paid $42,000 for. Now you can read that 2 ways, and the way you read it tells you a lot about which side of this you're going to land on. Maybe he was a shrewd man who knew they wanted his land and decided to make them pay. Or maybe he was a man who didn't actually want to sell at all and kept raising the price, so the answer would always be no, without him ever having to say no. I've come to think it was the second one. I think Marv loved that he had something the in-crowd wanted and couldn't have. I think for once the outsider held the cards, and I don't think he ever meant to fold them. So the deal died. And the concrete family who still wanted to build did what people with standing in a small town can do. They went to the town and got the land around his shop rezoned, and they built their plant right there next to him. A concrete batch plant, right next door to a man who just refused to be bought out. You can imagine the meetings. We had a lot of them. There were hearings about the dust, about the noise, about the trucks rolling through, and Marv stood up at those hearings and fought it. He wasn't the only one worried about it, but he fought hardest because it was going to be his fence line. And the town listened politely, the way towns do, and then approved it anyway. When the final vote came, he was the lone, one man against the room. And the plant went up. Now here's where it gets into the weeds, and I want you to stay with me in the weeds, because the weeds are the whole point. The way the plant got built, Marv said it cut off the road he'd been using to get to his own shop. He claimed his customers would now have to drive across the concrete company's property just to reach him. Whether that was completely true, I honestly couldn't tell you. To this day it got argued every direction. But he believed it. He believed they'd boxed him in on purpose. Then came the sewer. The town cited him for not being hooked up to the municipal sewer line and for having junk cars on his lot. The sewer hookup was going to cost him something like $80,000. And of course, to run the line where it needed to go, he'd have to cross about 8 feet of the concrete company's property. 8 feet. The whole war in the end came down to about 8 feet of dirt, and who would let a pipe cross it? The town wouldn't give him the easement, or the path to getting it kept closing, and he got fined. $2,500 for the violations. He paid it, But when he wrote the check, he wrote a single word in the memo line. Cowards. I think about that check a lot, because that's not the act of a man who's given up. That's the act of a man who's keeping score. That's a man who has decided somewhere deep down that he is right and they are wrong, and that someday the ledger is going to get balanced. He's just not telling anybody when. In the early 2000s, Marv sold his land after all. Sold it to a trash company for $400,000 more than he'd ever have gotten from the concrete people. So in a cold way, he won that round. And he put everything else up for auction. The tools, the equipment, the contents of a life. Sold it all off. Everything sold but one thing. The bulldozer. He had this big Komatsu, an enormous yellow machine, and at the auction nobody bought it. It just sat there. And here is where the story turns from a property dispute into something I can only call a kind of darkness, because in the recordings he made later, and he made hours of them, hours of tape talking into a microphone alone, he says the bulldozer not selling was a sign from God, that God had left him the machine on purpose, that God had kept him single and childless his whole life, so that when the time came, he'd have nothing holding him back from doing what he was meant to do. God built me for this job, he said. He said it was his cross to carry. He said it in God's name. And I want to be careful here because it would be easy and almost comforting to just call him crazy and close the book. Crazy is a clean answer. Crazy means it couldn't happen to your neighbor, couldn't happen to you. But I've listened to the way people describe those tapes, and what comes through isn't really madness in the way we like to picture it. Wild eyes foaming. What comes through is something colder and more familiar. It's a man who has spent years being told no, by people he doesn't respect, and who has slowly, methodically talked himself into the idea that he is no longer bound by the same rules as everyone else, that he is special, that the law, the town, the give and take that lets people live near each other, none of it applies to him anymore, because he has been chosen. That's not a lightning strike of insanity. That's a slow rot. And it grew in the same shed where the machine grew. Because that's the other thing he did with that unsold bulldozer. He took it home, and for about 18 months, he armored it. He was a master welder, remember? This wasn't a man banging on metal. This was craft. He built a steel shell around the cab 2 layers and poured concrete in between over a foot thick in places. He left slits to see through, then mounted little video cameras with screens inside the cab so he could drive it sealed up tight with no way for anyone to reach him. He built gun ports. He laid in rifles and ammunition. He thought about how he'd get in, and he built it so the hatch could only be operated from the inside. Once he climbed in and sealed it, no one on earth was getting him out. He did all of this in the evenings, while the town went about its business, while we waved. The morning of June 4th, 2004 was an ordinary morning. That's the thing nobody who wasn't there ever quite understands. It was a Friday. People were at work. The town was open. And then near the western edge of town, a wall of Marv's shed came apart, and the thing came out. I have heard people who saw it that day try to describe it, and they all reach for the same word eventually. They say it didn't look real. It was the size of a small building, this gray armored slab moving on tracks, and it moved slowly. That's the part that haunts. It wasn't fast. An 85-ton machine doesn't race. It came on at a walking pace, almost a stroll. And somehow that was worse because there was nothing frantic about it. It was deliberate. It had a list. The first thing it went for was the concrete plant. Of course it was. The blade came down and the walls of that plant came apart like they were made of paper, and that was the first 911 call, and from there the whole town knew all at once that something was happening that none of us had words for. From the concrete plant it turned toward downtown, and one by one it went down the list. The town hall. The blade went into the town hall and the building folded. The home of a former mayor, a bank, the library, the hardware store, the old department store that had been on that corner longer than I'd been alive. Every single building it hit when you looked later had a name attached to it. A person Marv felt had wronged him. He wasn't smashing the town at random. He was working through a grudge address by address, and the machine was just the pencil he was crossing names off with. It came for the newspaper, too. The man who ran our paper had covered Marv's fights for years, had written about the hearings and the disputes, and Marv had put him on the list for it. The editor was inside the newspaper building with another fellow when the blade turned toward them. They got out the back as the front of the building came down. He has said since that if he'd tripped on the way out, he wouldn't have lived to tell about it. That's how close it was. A man's whole life the difference of a stumble. And here is the strange mercy at the center of this whole thing, the fact that separates Granby from 100 worse stories nobody else died. It should have been a massacre. A man with a list of over 100 people he felt had wronged him sealed inside an unstoppable machine in the middle of a working town on a weekday. It should have ended with bodies. But the buildings emptied out ahead of him. The slowness of the machine, the very thing that made it so awful to watch, also gave people time minutes, sometimes only seconds to run. The police were screaming for evacuations, going door to door, getting people clear of the next thing on the list before the blade got there. He fired his rifles. He drove that blade into buildings that had been emptied moments before. The disregard for whether anyone was still inside was total. And yet through some combination of warning and luck and the plain slowness of the thing, the only blood spilled that day was his own, because they could not stop it. That's the part that turned this from a local tragedy into a national legend. They threw everything they had at it. The police fired, and the rounds just pocked the steel and bounced off. They couldn't get to him through the armor. Other heavy machines tried to push it to block it, and it shrugged them aside. There's a story, and I don't know if it's true, but people up here swear by it that someone in the state government was so out of options they actually talked about whether they could bring in a helicopter with a missile. A missile for a bulldozer in a Colorado tourist town. That's how far past the edge of normal we'd gone. It went on like that for over 2 hours. 2 hours and 17 minutes the records say, though. When you're living it, time stops meaning anything. 2 hours of a machine no one could touch, crawling through a town picking off buildings, while the whole place held its breath. And then it stopped. He drove into the last building, the old department store, and as the machine pushed through it, came down into a basement, and one of the treads dropped, and the engine bound up, and the thing that nothing could stop simply got stuck. The unstoppable machine was beaten by a hole in the floor. There's something almost unbearable about that. After all the armor, all the planning, all the talk of God and destiny, it ended because the ground gave way under him. The machine sat there dead in the wreckage. The SWAT team moved in, climbed up on top of that hot steel shell, and tried to figure out how to get inside a box built so that no one could get inside. And while they were working on it from down in the cab, there was a single shot. He'd carried a pistol in with him. When the machine stopped, when there was nothing left to do, he ended it himself. The only life he took that day was his own. They had to cut the machine open to get him out. It took them a long time. I remember the days after more than I remember the day itself. The day was chaos and noise and disbelief. The days after were quiet, and the quiet is what stays with you. The town was a ruin down the middle. 13 buildings hit the heart of our little downtown, caved in, millions of dollars of damage. They put it around 7 million. But you can't put a number on the things that mattered. The library was full of mud and broken shelving. The store that had been on that corner for generations was a pile. There was glass in the street for weeks. You'd be walking along and there'd be a glitter of it ground into the pavement, and you'd know exactly where it came from. And underneath the cleanup there was this thing nobody quite said out loud, which was, it could have been so much worse, and it wasn't. And we didn't entirely understand why we'd been spared. That kind of luck doesn't feel like relief exactly. It feels like a debt you don't know how to pay. We kept saying to each other, nobody died. Nobody died, like it was a fact we had to keep checking to make sure it was still true. We rebuilt. Oh, that's what towns like this do. We're stubborn people. The buildings went back up, some in the same spot, some not. Life folded back over the wound the way it does. New families moved in over the years who don't know any of this happened, who walk past lots that have been rebuilt twice over and have no idea. And maybe that's how it should be. You can't make a town carry a thing forever. But here's what we didn't expect. We thought when the dust settled that the rest of the world would see what we saw, a sad, frightening thing that a wronged man had done to people who, whatever their faults mostly, didn't deserve it. That's not what happened. What happened was that Marv became a legend. Out there, out in the wide world that never had to sweep up the glass. It started slow, and then it never stopped. People learned the story, and a lot of them decided Marv Heemeyer was a hero. The little guy ground down by the bureaucrats and the rich men and the good old boys who finally said enough and built himself a tank and made them pay. They gave the machine a name, the Killdozer, and the name had a swagger to it, an admiration. They made memes. They made jokes. There were people who treated June 4th like a holiday. Someone even made up a kind of mock-heroic legend about him, a tidy little fable, where he sealed himself in his righteous machine and took down the corrupt town, and the only life he took was his own like a martyr. And that fable got passed around for years by people who'd never set foot in Grand County and never met a soul who lived through it. The man who ran our newspaper, the one who barely got out the back door, called it the second rampage, and I think that's exactly right. The first rampage knocked down our buildings. The second one knocked down the truth, and it's still knocking it down all these years later. So how do you live with it? That's really the only question left, and I've had a long time to chew on it, and I'm not sure I have an answer so much as a way of holding it. I want to be fair to Marv. I do, because the legend isn't built on nothing. He was wronged in the small, grinding, deniable ways that small towns wrong people. The deal that died, the plant they put on his fence line, the road, the 8 feet of dirt, the fine, none of that was right. The good old boys did box him in, and they did it with paperwork and polite votes so that no single one of them ever had to feel like the villain. If you've ever been the outsider in a place like this, ever felt the town close its ranks against you, over something you couldn't even point to, then some part of you understands the rage. I'd be lying if I said I didn't. But here's where the legend and I part ways, and where I think the people who cheer for him have made a mistake they'll never have to pay for. Being wronged is not the same as being right. What was done to Marv was a series of petty injustices. What Marv did was try to destroy a whole town, the bank teller who never voted on his sewer, the librarian, the old folks in the houses near the buildings on his list, the kid who might have been walking past the hardware store. He didn't aim at the men he hated. He aimed at the place they lived in, and everyone in it was just supposed to get out of the way in time. That nobody died wasn't his mercy. It was our luck and the police running door to door and a machine too slow to catch anyone who ran. He'd built a thing that couldn't tell the difference between the guilty and the innocent. And then he climbed inside it and decided that difference didn't matter. And the God business? I can't follow him there at all. A man who tells himself God built him to do this is a man who has found a way to stop being responsible for himself. That's not faith. That's the most dangerous thing a person can do, which is to dress up his own wrath as a holy errand, so he never has to look at it plain. The legend skips all that. The legend needs him pure. And I think it tells you something a little frightening about the world right now, the way a man who tried to flatten his neighbors gets turned into a folk hero by strangers who like the feeling of it. The feeling of finally getting back at the people who keep you down. I understand the feeling. I've had the feeling. But a feeling is a poor thing to build a hero out of, and the people who built him into one never had to live in the rubble of what the feeling actually does. We did. We had to live in it. I'll tell you how I carry it in the end. There's an empty stretch downtown where one of the buildings used to be that took the longest to come back. For years I'd drive past it, and I'd think about all of it at once, not in pieces the way I've told it to you, but all at once the way it actually lives in a person. I'd think about the decent man who fixed mufflers and the cold voice on the tapes and how they were the same man and how that's the most frightening fact of the whole thing. I'd think about the 18 months in the shed and how we waved. I'd think about the word cowards on a check and how a grudge fed long enough in the dark stops being a grudge and becomes a kind of religion. I'd think about the editor and the difference of a single stumble. And I'd think about all those strangers out there laughing, making him a saint, and I'd feel something close to grief, but not for Marv, for the truth, for how easily it gets paved over. 'Cause that's the real lesson of Granby if there is one, and it isn't a comfortable one. It isn't fight the bureaucrats, and it isn't he was crazy. It's smaller and harder than that. It's that a town can wrong a man in ways too small to ever be called a crime, and a man can answer in a way too large to ever be called justice. And both of those things can be true at the same time sitting in the same valley, and neither one cancels the other out. The pettiness was real. The horror was real. And the only people who get to pretend it's a simple story are the ones who weren't here. We were here. We don't get to pretend. So I drive past the lot, and I don't make him a hero, and I don't make him a monster. I just remember a regular man who decided one no at a time that the rules were for everybody but him. And I remember how long it took, and how quiet it was, and how close it came to being so much worse. And I think the next one is always being built in some shed, somewhere in the evenings by somebody we'd all wave to. That's the part nobody wants to hear. That's the part I can't put down.